see some new people as well. So I'm excited today, after spending the last year reading one long, difficult text that I hope many of you enjoyed, The Human Condition. We're going to take a short break from that and read some of Hannah Arendt's shorter essays, which allow us to, get a wide variety of her interests and ideas. The one we have in mind for today is We Refugees, which I know was sent around. It was originally published in a newspaper and then republished in a book, Hannah Arendt's first writings, edited by Jerry Cohn and Ron Feldman. I see Jerry's on the call. Hello, Jerry. Please turn your mics off for now, although I'm going to try and be brief in my remarks and then hopefully allow us to have a conversation. One of the nice things about this essay is it's a little bit more accessible than some of the parts of The Human Condition.
Recording is on.
And we're going to hope that we can have an interesting conversation about it. It's also, of course, incredibly topical given what's going on in the world today. So I just wanted to start then by actually asking people about these first couple of sentences or paragraphs where Hannah Arendt says we don't like to be called refugees. She makes this distinction between the old idea of refugees, which is someone who's been driven out of some place for an act or an opinion, in a sense, a political refugee, versus the new idea is simply someone who arrives somewhere else. Instead of being driven out, they arrive and without means, in need of help. So the old refugee is an actor, someone who has made themselves unwelcome for something they did, and the new refugee is someone who arrives seeking help. Amongst this, she talks about this idea of the loss of home, the loss of language, the loss of a life world, the loss of the simplicity of gestures that people understand, the loss of friends, and the rupture of our private lives. Molly Crabapple, who's a wonderful artist and writer, just has a book came out this year called Drawing Blood. And in it, she spends some time in some Syrian refugee camps. And she writes this. I thought I'd read it and then maybe let people talk briefly about it. She says, for all of its legal importance, the word refugee is a flattening word. It flattens. It strips individuality away, bearing instead images of the huddled, weeping mass. Refugee evokes pity, and pity is a corrosive thing. In her essay, We Refugees, the philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote, quote, we fight like madmen for private existences with individual destinies. Arendt, a refugee from the Nazis, knew of what she spoke. And so here we have Arendt and Molly Crabapple talking about the danger, the flattening aspect, the desire not to be called a refugee. We have a situation in Europe, in Syria right now, in which the Syrians are being referred to as refugees by some, but not others, and it's become an incredibly political contest. To call them refugees suggests that they're deserving of help arriving in Europe. But some people don't want to call them refugees. They want to call them immigrants because they're saying they're not coming out of need. They're coming out of a desire. And so there is a huge dispute about how to refer to many of these Syrians coming into Europe. So I thought I'd simply ask if anyone would like to comment or respond to this question of what a refugee is and how one, whether one should refer to the Syrians today in Europe as refugees. Does anyone want to add to that or say anything? We're going to try and make this a little more interactive than some of our past sessions and see if that works. You'll have to turn a mic on if you'd like to say. Hello?
Can you hear me? This is
I can't.
Suzanne.
Who's this? Go ahead.
Yeah, it struck me that the term refugee really strips all agency from those that it's attributed to, and that's part of the problem. It really implies a hierarchy that where they're at the bottom, and that's a problem.
Okay, I think that's a good point, and it's a point Arendt and Molly Crabapple are both making. I guess one question then is what to call the refugee if we don't want to call them a refugee. What do we call? I mean, we have this issue, right, where some of the people coming out are coming out because of things they've said or done, but many are simply coming to Europe in search of a better life as immigrants, and to not call them a refugee, not, you say refugee is hierarchical and it strips them of some agency, which may be true, but it also deprives them of the legal protections of a refugee. Because if they're not refugees, they have no right to enter Europe. So there's legal protections for refugees. Jerry, just don't hit share screen, Jerry Cohn, on your thing, on your screen. Anyway, does anyone want to? So Suzanne, I mean, you're right, and yet to take away the term refugee is to take away their legal protections. It's an important aspect to point out.
And I would agree with that, and that's an issue as well, right? There are folk that maybe need help from others, but it doesn't mean that they are incapable. And I think that's taking away not recognizing their capability and all the good things. Maybe that's the problem with the term refugee. And we need some other way to get them help, as we might need to offer anybody help who is new.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we want to. We do want. Yeah. Who's this?
I'm sorry. This is Jack Hirschfeld.
Hi, Jack.
I'd like to say something about this because this is something that I've been struggling with all my life. So I was born in Hitler's Germany, and being Jewish, I was not German. I was stateless. And my family escaped, and we came to America. And for a large part of my life, I tried to think of myself as a Holocaust survivor, which in a way I am. But of course, I really did not confront the Holocaust because I was out before the Holocaust began. So then I started to think, well, then what am I, right? And I thought immigrant. But that didn't work for me either, because immigrants in America are of three types. One type is a person seeking a better life, coming from someplace else seeking a better life. Another type is somebody who was forced here, like the slaves, for example. And the third is the refugee, the person who is driven out of his home and comes here for seeking refuge. And so I settled on the term refugee finally as a way of describing my own identity. And I think that I understand this quibble over the status of refugee, but the truth of the matter is that whether you are a refugee because you did something or a refugee because something was done to you, the person who seeks refuge is a refugee.
I take that point. And let's then push on this question of refugee. The overarching worry of this piece, I think, is that we refugees deny ourselves to be refugees, right, and also deny ourselves, in this particular case, to be Jews. We, instead of being refugees or Jews, want to be French, Czech, Austrian, or American. We want to assimilate. We want the optimism of forgetting our past quicker than anyone can imagine. We want this life is our real life. We want to forget our past life, which was in a sense a sham. Conjure magical futures. These are all phrases that Arendt uses in the text. And so it's important to remember that in a certain way, Arendt is asking us to resist the temptation to not call ourselves refugees, at least as I understand it, in order to be truthful to who we are, which is both refugees and Jews. The analog of this today would be that a Syrian family, and I'm using this as one example of many. It could be an Afghanistani family or others, arriving in Germany or in Norway. Can you turn your mic off? Arriving in Germany or in Norway would demand to simply be German or Norwegian and in a sense embrace optimistically this new life without reminding us of our old life. Arendt understands why there's this desire to do this, and it comes from a desire to overcome what she calls social discrimination. We don't want to be refugees because we don't want to be Jews, because when we are Jews and refugees, we are discriminated against, right? We can't ride on the subway without being told we're undesirable. We see this today, I think, especially around the world, but in this country as well, with Muslims and the veil, right? Muslims who wear the veil today are being accosted around the city and around the country. Also with African Americans and the police. And so these kinds of social discriminations make us, she says, quote, a little hysterical and drive us to what she calls the hopeless sadness of assimilationism and assimilationists. And so there is a way, there's an important way in which this essay is a plea to be true to who we are as refugees and as Jews. And there's a reason for that, which is what she ends the essay with, this idea of the conscious pariah. This to choose to be a Jew or a refugee, she says, is hard, because to be a Jew or a refugee is to subject yourself not only to social discrimination, but to, as Jack was saying, to be stateless. And to be stateless is to have no status in the world. To claim to be a Syrian today and not a German is to give up certain rights. It is to embrace an identity without rights, and to become merely a human, a refugee in the most flattening and derogatory sense of the word, which is someone who has nothing unless they're given help. And Arendt's response to this is this hidden idea of the Jewish pariah, the conscious pariah. But before we get to that, let me see if there's comments or thoughts on what she's talking about, on this idea of learning to embrace the hard choice of being a refugee, of not choosing to avoid social discrimination through assimilation. Does anyone want to talk to that, either within the text or within the Jewish question or within contemporary issues?
Hi, can you hear me, Roger?
Is this Rita?
Rita?
Yeah, if you could turn your camera down a little bit, we're just seeing the top of your head, but go ahead, we can hear you.
Okay, I can try. Is that better? Okay, so the one thing that I think is really important in this, for me, is the statement where she says, when she's talking about different people who've gone to see refugee committees, where she says, nobody knows who I am. And she repeats the same phrase again in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I think so we've got this double bind, haven't we? We've got the notion of refugees as a group, but this issue when society as a whole will not see them as individuals, as if their past lives have no meaning. And this issue about assimilation or standing on the outside is a problem. And it's something that Arendt herself had issues with. She was not perhaps as much of a pariah as sometimes she likes to see herself. And that's perhaps going too much, but in some of her letters to Carl Jaspers, she talks about the ways that she's had to hustle for work. And I find it interesting, right? This desire to be on the outside, on the margins, because you can see more about how a society works, yet at the same time, you have to do things that perhaps you don't want to do in order to survive.
I think those are good points. Certainly Arendt was at times, certainly did assimilate. The language of the essay is "we refugees," and I think the "we" is a difficult word in this context. At times she's clearly identifying with it, and at times she's trying to distance herself from it. She took great pride in becoming an American citizen when she did so. I think she also at times embraced being French when she was in France in the 30s. At the same time, she does see herself as someone who continues to write about Jewish issues. She does throughout the 30s and 40s. She continues to identify as a Jew, but let's also remember, she did become professor at different places, but she never became a permanent professor anywhere. She always remained on the margins, and I think that was a very conscious decision on her part to do so. So these are questions we can continue to talk about. Any other thoughts on this idea of what she sometimes calls the mania for refusing to keep our identity, our refugee identity, our pariah identity? Anyone else want to respond to that mania?
Roger, this is Diane Iden. I'm not sure it responds directly to that question, but what comes to mind as you've been talking in some of the comments is this idea about there's terminology using refugee, and there's legal implications for that. So there's some legal aspects to this. There's personal identity. There's a variety of things wrapped up. But I get this. One of the things I wondered if there was any discussion about or thoughts about is this idea of being a refugee, someone seeking refuge. But what about if it's on it? Not everyone who is a refuge remains, quote, a refuge, if we use that term. They wait for things to calm down, to improve, and go home, to want to go home, right? So it's more of a question about how does that equate into some of the conversations or discussions about being a refugee. You may go somewhere for a short period of time or for a few years, but the aspiration is to go back if conditions improve and allows for you to do that.
I think it's an excellent point, Diane. And I think that one of the questions people have about many refugees, and one of the things that we often ask refugees is, you arrive in this camp, are you hoping to stay or are you hoping to go back? And I think that there's very different answers to those questions by different people. Many of the people who are staying in Turkey right now are hoping to go back. As I understand it, most of the people who end up going to Germany and Norway are hoping to stay. I'm sure there's exceptions to that. That's just been my impression from reading about the current situation. And this raises questions about whether a refugee, the difference between what Jack was talking about, he's saying a refugee is a kind of immigrant, which I take to be true, and yet if we're trying to understand different people, some are refugees. They're seeking, they could be seeking temporary refuge until they can go back. Versus an immigrant is someone who actually doesn't want temporary refuge and wants to come and make a new life. And in many ways, that distinction is one way to think about the different kinds of the different people who are applying for asylum or immigration status or other kinds of protections. Are there comments?
I need to say here about something about Hannah Arendt and her situation. So this was written during the period of the Hitler's control of Germany, and she's talking about a specific group of people. One of the things she's talking about is a specific group of people to which she belongs, which is people who had a public reputation in Germany and later on in other places in Europe, who were driven out because they were Jews. And that's one group of people to which she belongs, and she speaks about them a lot in this essay. So when she's talking about actually distinctions among Jews, for example, and the fact that you cannot escape being a Jew when you try to assimilate, all of those things really relate to that specific fact. When you talk about the refugees in general, that is, even of this period, for example, in my case, we had a family, right? So my parents never mastered English, nor in some ways did they really want to. They had left 3 countries before they came here. So they had their only national identity was Jewish. Whereas my sister and I tried very hard to become Americans. We wanted to become Americans because we thought we had come to a place where that was possible, where you could shed the identity that came out of being Jewish and identify with everybody else who was not Jewish and be part of that community. I think that I don't know whether I know that Hannah Arendt never confronted that part of it, because assimilation for her was the people of her generation who actually were multilingual and so had an easy time to some extent moving from place to place, and who were in that period of a very unique kind of refugee, which was a person driven out of his home because of who he was, not because of anything he did, and not because of anything that was happening in his home, but only because of who he was.
I think that's exactly right, Jack, and that's how she starts the essay, right? She says that's, the old refugee was someone driven out because of what they did. We're people who've been driven out simply because of who we are and for no other reason. And we didn't want to leave, and we arrive and we need help, and so we become dependent. We're also, usually if people are driven out because of what they've done, there's not that many of them, and they can be welcomed in as courageous, as heroes. They're usually given lecture fees and asked to talk because they, are, if not famous, at least representative of a kind of courageous or heroic dissident. Whereas when masses, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people show up, usually the welcoming country is not so welcoming. And that is a big difference, and one that clearly she's talking about. And she rightly predicted that this would only become an ever-growing problem in the modern world, which it has over the last 70 years since she wrote this, or 65 years, and certainly is today. Are there other thoughts or comments before we move on to the sort of final parts of the essay on the conscious pariah?
Yeah. Hi, it's Harold. I just wanted to mention I have something to say toward the end. I don't want to to jump ahead, but I did want to mention that this article was written for the Menorah Journal in 1943, Henry Hurwitz piece, right, out of Harvard. I think that's important. It wasn't written for the Atlantic. It wasn't written for a general periodical. It was written very specifically for the Menorah Journal. That's what I wanted to say.
There's no doubt she's talking to other Jews here in this article. That's who she's addressing. And we have to take seriously that what she's saying is somewhat unpopular. What she's saying to Jews is, for many good reasons, right, that I understand, we are acting as a people, as a refugee class, and as Jews who have come out of Germany into, in this case, the United States. We're denying who we are. Now, Hannah Arendt was not a religious Jew, but she's well known for saying that if you are attacked as a Jew, you have to respond as a Jew. And her point here is that this mania for refusing to keep our Jewish identity, this deep desire, Jack Hirschfeld was just saying, that he and his sister wanted to assimilate, but his parents, didn't. Arendt is really talking, and he's right. She's talking about that class of Jews, and there were many different classes of Jews, and she talks about how there were the French Jews who looked upon all the German Jews as sort of what you call it, Boches, the German word for sort of blockheaded Jews, as sort of Ostjuden. But the Ostjuden Jews, the Jews from Poland, looked at the German Jews as Yekas, as sort of like the elite. And that there became all these kind of inter-Jewish different spats and disagreements. So yes, we there's no way that you can say that all of this is unitary. But she's saying that there is a deep driving desire amongst the Jews, and I don't think it's here only Jews. I think we can see this in many different refugee crises, that when you get to the land you're in, whether it's, she talks about Mr. Cohn, right? That's a great story that she talks about, where, first he goes to Czechoslovakia, and after he'd been 150% German, he becomes Czech, and then he gets to Austria, and he becomes an Austrian patriot. And then in France, he says, I fight for French, and I become, my ancestors are the French. And she says that there's this desire to prove oneself. Why is that, right? It's a desire to avoid social discrimination. We are, as she says, social animals. What does that mean to say that we are social animals? It means that we take much of our self-image and our pride in the way that we succeed and are seen by others in society. And there's this desire to fit in. She says, very few of us have the strength to conserve our integrity if our social and political and legal statuses are confused. If we are discriminated against socially, it's very hard to maintain our integrity and say, well, that's social discrimination, but I'm still an equal citizen. I'm still a human. I'm still a person, a citizen of this country. And so there's this desire to deny a part of ourselves, to assimilate. And this is, her work on assimilation, right, which is in many of her books, her dissertation, Rahel Vaunhagen, but also in the Jew as Pariah, and in many other of her works, is something that is taken up by many people, talking about assimilation of all sorts of groups in society today. And for her, there is a deep and terrifying danger of assimilation. she calls it she calls it the in another essay, in the essay on the Jewish pariah, she talks about the treacherous promise of equality which assimilation has held out, right? The desire that assimilation holds out, the treacherous promise of equality. That's something that's so hard for many of us to understand because we think of equality as something that's good. But the danger of equality, the treacherous promise of equality, and the reason it's treacherous is that it denies who we are. In seeking equality, in seeking to become American and to gain equality within a social sphere, we must necessarily deny a part of who we are. And this danger of assimilation, this danger of equality, is something Arendt is alert to and focused on her entire career. And underlying it, I'm going to make one last point here, underlying it is the fact and the value that she argues is the core fact and core value of human democratic politics, which is plurality. Meaningful, unique difference. And so much of the way she approaches the Jewish question is from her awareness that part of what it has always meant to be a Jew was to be separate, to be different. And that to assimilate as a Jew is treacherous because it threatens Jewish identity. That doesn't mean she herself was a religious Jew who wanted to always be separate. But she does come to see that as a Jew, it's important for her always to retain part of a Jewish tradition that separates her from society, because that's what makes her her as an individual. And the part that she wants to hold on to, right, is not the religious part. It's what she calls being a conscious pariah. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a second, but maybe there's some responses to anything that's been said so far before I do. Comments?
Hi. Can I speak? Okay. When I was reading the end of the text, I remembered the French movie Entre les Murs, The Class. There, I don't know if you watched this film, this movie, but it's high school class in Paris. And all the students are very, very angry, and they talk to the French teacher. Why don't you use our culture's examples or words? Why everything is so French? And so there is a tension, there is an anger. Of course, I can understand there is, of course, it's a Jewish culture, and Arendt is speaking up from this place. But I think this idea, the conscious pariah, has to do with the thinking without banisters and the working without a long-term contract, and don't have anything fixed, anything to use as I don't know, a kind of as a banister, anything. Don't have anything to hold on. So I think it's one. I don't know but it seems to me as one of the most personal Arendt tests, and I think it's a challenge. So it's so important today. It's in Syria. Any culture, any country, any refugee. This idea is important, I think. That's it.
I think this referring to the class is a very interesting comment on the current condition of assimilation, the current status of assimilation. When I think of assimilation in the U.S., I know that at the turn of the century, people came from all over Europe, and in America, there were newspapers in virtually every language. And there were, I'd like to call them ghettos, but there were blocks of population who lived together with other people who came from the same place that they did, trying to preserve their identity. But it only took a generation or two for that to disappear. And one of the reasons for that was that connection to the home country was very difficult. It was a letter took a long time to go in either direction. Many places you couldn't receive a letter. You certainly couldn't talk by telephone, and so on and so forth. Things are very different today. Today, people who come to the U.S. or to any other country can connect with their home country in many different ways instantly, not only through satellite communication and the telephone, but also think about, for example, The Class, right, which is a French film, available in the U.S. on a DVD. Anybody can look at it, right? You don't have to wait for it to come to the theater. It doesn't come and go. It's there. And so you find the phenomenon, for example, of, let us say, Pakistani supermarkets with a separate video section where the customers can go and find films from India and Pakistan that they can look at that refer to their own culture. And so the preservation of the culture that people are leaving is much easier today than it was years and years ago. And for that reason, I think, maintenance of identity by immigrants, why won't you call them refugees, by immigrants, is much easier than it was a generation or two ago.
Can you hear me, Roger?
Yep,
Roger?
go ahead.
I think that's an important point. I think one of the problems is that this question of identity is a very different question today than it was even 20 or 30 years ago. And but that our legal and social institutions and structures have not kept pace with what technology has made available to us. And I think that that's something that needs wider discussion.
To both of those comments, and also to comments about The Class, the movie, yes, it's much easier today technologically and transportation wise to keep in touch with your other country. And this raises questions of how identity has changed today. But I wonder, and I'm not a scholar of immigration and assimilation, so I raise this as a question, but my gut instinct is that the fact that Jack mentioned, which is that parents read the newspaper of their home country and language, but the children assimilated, is largely still the case today. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. Yes, there are Pakistani or French videos available, but they're as likely to be read by intellectuals in New York as they are by second or third generation Pakistanis. And while some second and third generation French or Pakistanis may read those journals or watch those movies, so may some, fourth generation Jews or WASPs. And so I'm not sure that identity or that intellectual identification with cultures is challenging the basic American idea of assimilation. I could be wrong. Like I said, I'm not a scholar of this. I'm happy to have someone tell me I am.
Roger, that's just the flip side of what I brought up, which is at the same technology that enables maintenance of a prior identity enables interpenetration of cultures. The same technology enables that, so that, for example, a person who is not Indian would never have seen an Indian movie a generation ago, right? Even though they were making plenty of movies in India. Right? People today don't know that Egypt has a tremendous film industry, and one of the reasons for that is that we don't have a lot of Egyptian immigrants to this country. If we did, I think there'd be more exposure to that culture. So yes, it's true. I think you're right. I think that it's just the flip side of the same issue, and what it speaks to, or what I think it demonstrates, is that the entire idea of identity has shifted in the last couple of generations, and the identification by class, for example, has diminished as a consequence.
Certainly, that's true. That I agree with much of what you said, but certainly the lack of identification with a class has diminished. Although there's some potential that that's returning with certain movements around Occupy or inequality. But when the lack of identity around a class or institutional identity around interests begins to wane, that is for Arendt incredibly dangerous, because what it means is that people become depoliticized and around interests, and that loss of politicization around group interests makes them susceptible to what she calls mass movements. Without an identity as part of a class or of a group that has interests that engages in politics, people lose a sense of belonging and being at home somewhere, and seek that belonging in movements. And there's an opening for a kind of mass politics, which is deeply dangerous from her point of view. Whether these kinds of identity politics questions can replace class is an interesting question. And I think that I'm going to at least move a little bit forward, and then we can always come back to this last part of the essay on the final 2 pages, where she raises this question of what we're going to call the conscious pariah, which she calls the conscious pariah. So she says on the penultimate page of the essay, and here I'm just going to focus a bit on the essay because this is, I think, the crux of it. She says, before you cast the first stone at the Jews the refugees who assimilate or who deny their Jewish or refugee status, remember that being a Jew does not give any legal status in this world. And I think we can say the same thing about being a Syrian today. There's simply no legal status that comes of it. With the exception, and here's where some of the earlier conversation comes into play, that being a refugee does give one certain rights in international law today that it might not have in the 1940s when Arendt wrote this. That said, international law is still developing and not always enforceable. But to deny refugees en masse, as for example some of the countries in Europe tried to do, opens one to serious condemnation for violating international law today. If you could turn your mics off when you're not speaking, it's really helpful so we don't get that feedback. So there's this idea, and this raises this question about a Jew or a refugee or a Syrian is simply reduced to nothing but human being, as she writes right below that, which is, for those of you who've read some of her other work, one of Arendt's most insightful and important points about the danger of the rise of human rights. Because international law creates legal rights for people who are simply refugees, it actually encourages people to identify as refugees so that they can get those rights. It thus encourages them to say, I have nothing. I am helpless and I need your help. It thus encourages them to act, as she'll say in The Origins of Totalitarianism, like helpless animals, and to appeal to agencies, human rights agencies, that are analogous to what she calls the Society for Protection Against Cruelty to Animals. It depoliticizes people. It makes them appeal simply for social help and say, I'm helpless. In order to get the social help, you have to be merely human. You have to be helpless. And so the whole human rights regime actually encourages the depoliticization of those who are forced to leave, who are forced to flee, who are refugees. And she says that it's very hard to avoid this because we don't want to suffer and we need help. And in a society of social discrimination, we will throw ourselves upon anyone who can help us. And then she has this word but. If you're using the edition in Jewish writings at the bottom of page 273, 2 lines from the bottom, but it is equally true that the very few among us who have tried to get along without all these tricks and jokes of adjustment and assimilation have paid a much higher price than they could afford. They jeopardized the few chances even outlaws are given in a topsy-turvy world. The attitude of these few, whom following Bernard Lazare one may call conscious pariahs, can be as little explained by recent events alone as the attitude of our Mr. Cohn. These few who, in a sense, resist, she says, and here she's using a particularly Jewish example, hold on to what she calls the hidden tradition of Jewish history. She names people involved here: Heinrich Heine, Rahel Varnhagen, Sholem Aleichem, Bernard Lazare, Franz Kafka, and Charlie Chaplin. These are Jews who chose not to become parvenus, not to become upstarts, not to seek protections, who became conscious pariahs. And she says in the next paragraph, these few refugees who insist upon telling the truth, even to the point of indecency, because the truth is not decent, at least the truth of the Holocaust was not, get in exchange for their unpopularity one priceless advantage. It's actually two. She says one, but it's two. One is history is no longer a closed book to them, and two, politics is no longer the privilege of the Gentiles. One, they enter history as Jews, as themselves. They are no longer simply going to become part of mass, the assimilated mass, whoever country there are, of Americans or Germans or Austrians or French. They insist we matter. And we, whoever we are as Jews in this particular case, have to be counted in history. And two, she says, politics is no longer a privilege of the Gentiles. They become political. Their actions, their insistence on taking themselves seriously as Jews, and this goes to what was being said about the movie The Class, they say, you have to listen to us. You have to include us in your civilization, whether you're in France or in the United States. You can't think simply of the United States as what it was without us Jewish refugees. You can't expect us simply to assimilate. You also must consider us and understand we're part of the country too. And this is what so many of the culture wars of the last X number of years, I don't, we can go back a different number of years, are about. Different groups saying we've been excluded, whether it's blacks or women or Jews or immigrants, are homosexuals. We've been excluded from the narrative, and we need to be included. And this is part of the politics that Arendt is here talking about. Part of it is demanding that we be included in the image and the idea and the identity of the country. That's one part. But there's, for her, a bigger part, which she then says, and this is where she's in the very sentence after that, politics is no longer the privilege of the Gentiles, she writes, they know that the outlawing of the Jewish people in Europe has been followed closely by the outlawing of most European nations. What does she mean by that? The Gypsies, the Roma in this case, but also Poles, Czechs at one point, Slovaks, Catalonians in Spain. There are many nations which become outlawed. The Kurds are one example that we're currently dealing with today. And that refugees driven from country to country represent the vanguard of their peoples if they keep their identity. So that these refugees who are conscious pariahs, who keep their identity, respond to the destruction of peoples, which is happening over and over again, and thus to the treacherous promise of equality which assimilation has held out, by saying we need to preserve ourselves, we need to hold on to our traditions, and thus enrich the world with the plurality of the many nations of the world. We should not, as an ideal, if we're refugees, simply say it's all right if the Jews die out, or if it's all right if the Kurds die out, because what makes humanity great from Arendt's point of view is that plurality, is that uniqueness, is that difference, are the different traditions. And that can be a religious tradition, but it can also be a cultural and intellectual tradition. And we can hold on to these different traditions for something valuable in them. And that's what she's talking about at the end in this idea of the possibility of entering history and being political as conscious pariahs. So that's how I understand the thrust of this essay at the end. Are there thoughts or comments that people would like to make? Questions, thoughts, comments?
Just one last thought I'd like to add, which is, as mentioned earlier, this piece was addressed to Jews. And in that period, in the mid-40s, when refugees had, I think the flow of refugees by then had really stopped. But there was still a tremendous resistance within the Jewish community in America to this flow of refugees. We have to remember that it was a period of great anti-Semitism in the U.S., and there were a lot of established Jewish families that felt that this influx was going to arouse anti-Semitism. And a lot of the refugees were encouraged to assimilate quickly. Don't show off your Jewishness. Change your name. A lot of them did change their name, and especially within the intellectual community that Hannah Arendt was a part of. So I think part of this is a polemic regarding or defending the Jewishness of the Jewish refugee.
That's great. Thank you, Jack. Are there other thoughts, comments?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody else. Go.
Okay.
Turn your microphone up.
Up.
Or your.
Get closer to it.
I'll get closer to it. I lived in Norway in 1965. I was 20 years old. And at that time, all over Norway where I traveled, there were posters for discussion groups for Jewish groups. And the topic was always, how can Jewishness survive in a country that does not discriminate? This was the hot topic of the day for all Jews in Norway. And it sort of made me wonder, gee, can these people ever be happy? Here they are in a tolerant place, and they're still having a big problem with it. But I was 20 then. I wasn't too into the nuances of being a refugee or an immigrant or whatever. So I just thought I would add that as a comment, that it was, you go to northern Norway, you'd see signs like that. You go to southern Norway, it was all over the country. So also, I might like to comment about the situation of the Tibetans. I underwrote some young Tibetan students that were living in India in Dharamsala. And these people have been stateless forever. People who are born in India who are of Tibetan heritage are still stateless. And there's sort of a push among the Tibetans themselves to not assimilate and to hope that they can go home, even though this has been going on for 65 years now. And it's a very sad situation for them because the young people are pretty much blocked from assimilating. And this is a very rough situation, which I sometimes think people don't quite recognize. That's all.
Thank you. There are 20 or 30 million, if not more, refugees. I may have the numbers fully off. All over the world, many of them living in camps for multiple generations now. And many of these people are stateless. We have it's becoming one of the largest populations in the world now is stateless peoples. And these are people who have no state to enforce their rights and can only claim rights as human rights, which, as we saw for Arendt, reduces them to begging in a certain way. A huge problem. Other comments?
Yes, I just wanted a couple of things. One, people may be interested in the work of Giorgio Agamben, who has written about this and who works out of Hannah Arendt. His theory out of bounds, means without end, notes on politics. He says something which I think is quite important in this discussion. I'll read it very quickly because we're almost out of time. That there is no autonomous space in the political order of the nation state for something like the pure human in itself is evident at the very least from the fact that even in the best of cases, the status of refugee has always been considered a temporary condition that ought to lead either to naturalization or repatriation. A stable statute for the human in itself is inconceivable in the law of the nation state. So I think unless one really begins to talk about nativity, which is where the word nation comes from, and nation state, I think the last sentence in in this We Refugees, where she's saying that basically refugees are the vanguard. We need rights on this planet which are not tied to a nation state. Autonomous human beings, not
So I mean,
tied to a
this
nation.
is a huge question, Harold, and one that Arendt and her critics and her respondents have been engaged in for a long time. Can there be meaningful rights not attached to some kind of state system? She argues that at least within a nation state system, human rights are meaningless because there's no one to enforce them, and they become claims for protection like animals. With the rise of international law, there are, new questions about whether these claims of rights are more meaningful than she understood them to be. And this is, I think, one of the important questions of the next few decades, whether international law will become meaningful and enforceable. And certainly at times it has been in the last 40 or 50 years, especially in prosecution trials of war criminals. But, you're seeing in Europe right now what happens when international law says refugees must be accepted and dealt with, and hundreds of thousands of people show up, and the nation state says, "Now wait a second. I mean, Norway's closed its borders, but Sweden's closed its border. I mean, we're talking about some of the most open and tolerant states in the world are saying, no, enough is enough." And so international law is all well and good until a mass refugee situation hits, and it's very hard for it to be for it to continue in such situations. And so this does raise the question of what do we do with the millions and millions and millions of refugees who, whether they're Tibetan or Palestinian or other, are living all over the world in camps, in semi-permanent, if not permanent camps, that have no taxation, no ability to govern themselves, no ability to act in any kind of polity, without becoming, without, in a sense, becoming almost terrorists. But the question is, how do you politicize the status and the fact of refugees? How do you act politically as a refugee when you don't have a political community? And that's an incredibly important and difficult question that we're confronted with today. And I hope that's something that you'll think about coming out of this. We're out of time, and I think the plan is for next week to start another essay called On Violence. I'm also going to be sending out a week in advance a little video with some thoughts on it so that when we get to actually talking about it, we can have more of a discussion, which we're trying to do as well today. I very much look forward to seeing you next month and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much. Thank you all.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.